Harbor Freight released a new airbrush a few months ago, so naturally I had to check it out. This one is called the Avanti AIRBRUSH, which is Italian for to go or to move forward. It's a budget Chinese airbrush that goes for around $25 US, but like most things at Harbor Freight, you can usually get it on sale with a coupon. In the hand, it feels fine, nothing great, but it feels alright to me. Very similar to all the other clones that you could find on Amazon or on eBay. On Harbor Freight's website, they say that this airbrush is comparable to the Neo for Iwata, but as you'll see later on in this video, they literally just took the head design from the Iwata Eclipse and copied it in this airbrush. I like to see something original in a new airbrush, especially by a large company like Harbor Freight, so I was disappointed to see this. The Avanti has a standard 0.3mm needle and nozzle, which means it's a general use airbrush. A 0.3 is a very common starting point. It's what you see on most general use airbrushes. It's kind of that perfect middle ground. You can get in really close, spray some very fine details, some hairlines if you reduce a paint, and also if you're going to be spraying some thicker paint right out of the bottle, it's going to be a bit more forgiving than a smaller nozzle. The rear handle is simple and has a needle limiter or a trigger stop on the back, and what this screw does is very simple. It limits how far back you could pull the trigger. So as you can see here, if I tighten this screw down, I'm not able to pull that trigger back. But if I unscrew it a few turns, it'll set a limit on how far back I could pull the needle. If you're just starting out and you don't have any airbrush trigger control yet, this could be helpful for new painters so you don't accidentally spray too much paint. When you buy the Avanti airbrush, it comes in this nice blue packaging, and inside here you have a standard black box with that blue foam. This is what you usually see with most Chinese airbrushes. You of course get the airbrush itself, which comes with a removable paint cup on top here, which is a nice addition. And on the front of the airbrush, you do have a small needle protector. I have this off for most of this review, but just understand that this airbrush does come with one. I never paint with them on just because they tend to collect paint, but if you're just starting out, I'd recommend leaving it on just because it'll help prevent that needle tip. It also comes with 2 wrenches. The larger one is to remove the nozzle head assembly and the smaller one is to remove the nozzle. It also comes with some documentation, which is a user's guide. And I have to say that this is actually very well done. There's a lot of great information in here. So if you're just starting out, it's definitely worth taking a look through this. And like most airbrushes, the bottom of this has a 1/8 inch threading to connect to your air hose. It does not come with a quick adapter like the one I'm putting on right here. This is one from a Harder & Steenbeck airbrush. So if you like to use quick adapters, you're going to have to buy it separately. This top paint cup is removable, which I really like because if these wear out, you could swap it out with a new one, or you can add a larger cup if you want. Harbor Freight does not sell any extra cups, but the other ones that I own from Harder & Steenbeck and from the Neo for Iwata fit this perfectly. Unfortunately, the finishing within this paint cup is not good. There's like a gap at the point where the bottom of the cup and the threading starts, and it's in an area that's definitely going to be collecting paint if you don't clean out this cup very well when you finish painting. But I do want to remind you that this airbrush goes for only $25 US, so they have to cut costs somewhere. The outside of it though has a pretty nice finish to it, and you also have a small rubber gasket at the bottom here to prevent paint from leaking out between the threads. Underneath the macro lens, you can see that the chrome coating is actually quite nice. There's definitely some abrasions and some micro scratches going on, but I checked the entire airbrush multiple times and there's no major imperfections here, so this was very nice to see. Usually on cheaper airbrushes, you'll see an area that's kind of gouged out or has a deep scratch. None of that was going on here. The trigger itself is pretty flat and thin and has some nice knurling on the top of it to give you some grip. This kind of reminds me of the old school triggers that you'll see on older Iwatas. So let's get to the breakdown so you can see the internal parts. The first thing I'm doing is removing the paint cup, which is 9 milliliters. And then I'll unscrew the rear handle, loosen up the chucking nut, and remove the needle. From here, we can see the spring case, and all you need to do is unscrew it so you can fully remove the spring assembly. You could also adjust your trigger spring tension by how far you screw this in. Like always, I always recommend screwing it down pretty tight. That's going to give you a better seal between the needle and the nozzle. This spring assembly here is basically a clone of the Iwata design. It consists of 3 parts, the guide, the spring, and the housing. In my opinion, the build quality on these parts feels kind of cheap, but they still work and they do what they're intended to. As I said before, the trigger itself is pretty comfortable. It kind of narrows at the front and has some knurling at the top of it. When you remove it, it's a single piece that has a lever at the bottom. The lower part of this presses down on the piston to release air into the airbrush. There's a groove at the bottom of it, and when you reinstall it, that always goes toward the back of the airbrush. To remove the head cap, you want to use this large wrench that comes in the box, and once it's loose, all you need to do is unscrew it, but be careful here because the nozzle itself is floating in here and it's very easy to drop. There's also a second part to unscrew at the end of this. This part is called the nozzle cap, and you always need this on in order to spray paint. So this is what the entire head assembly looks like disassembled. It consists of these 3 parts. This head cap also has 3 holes to direct the airflow over the nozzle. This is identical to the Iwata Eclipse. And just to show you what I mean, I'm unscrewing the head cap on an Iwata Eclipse here, and you can see side by side the Eclipse is on the top and the Avanti is on the bottom. And you can see right here how similar they are. They're basically identical. This Avanti basically just copied it part for part. As I said at the start of the video, I'm a bit disappointed here. I would like to see a bit more innovation instead of just copying a better brand, but to me that seems like exactly what they did here. That's as far as I'm going to break down this airbrush, but of course in the back here you have the needle packing screw, which you can adjust with a special screwdriver, and at the bottom of the airbrush you have the air piston assembly. This nozzle is compression fit, so all you have to do is place it in like this, then take the head cap and screw it on to set it in place. Now everything on an airbrush should always be right around hand tight. You don't want to over tighten anything. So when I use this wrench, I'm not using it to tighten it down. I'm just using it for some grip, just to kind of snug it in place. Now usually in the videos, I just speed through this because it's pretty self-explanatory. It's everything we just did, but in reverse. But here I came across something that I haven't seen on any other airbrush brand. After installing the trigger, making sure that it's pressing down on the piston, I needed to reinstall the spring assembly. And what I noticed here is that the trigger lever connected to the end of this needle chucking guide is too large to easily fit back into the body of the airbrush. I don't know if I just got a bad unit here, like some quality control issues, but I could not get this back into the body of the airbrush. It took me about 10 minutes to do off camera. And I want to assure you here that this isn't user error. I've been doing this for decades and must have broken down my airbrushes thousands and thousands of times. I decided to take out my Iwata Eclipse here to show you how this works on a normal airbrush. The easiest way to do this is to first make sure that you have the trigger installed in the airbrush, and then I like to lean the trigger lever forward like you're seeing here so it doesn't get caught on the threads. And you can see just how easily it goes in. It doesn't get caught on anything. It's very simple to do, very straightforward. And then just line up the threads and screw it back in. So going back to the Avanti, I tried all different ways. I adjust the lever forward, backwards, straight. I really couldn't get it in. I eventually got it just with force. I pushed it all the way through. Probably damaged the threads. So I do hope that this is a one-off, a manufacturing error on my particular airbrush, but I'm not sure. This is the one I have and this is what I see. So if any of you watching this own this airbrush, let me know if you have the same problem with the back here. So besides that major issue, the build quality on this one is alright. It's nothing great, but for $25, I don't have any complaints. So to finish this video up, let's go to the most important part of an airbrush, and that's the way it sprays paint. The first thing that I'm doing here is checking the trigger consistency and the response rate, meaning how far I have to pull back on the trigger in order to get paint. I'm always holding down on the airbrush trigger so that it's continually spraying air, but a few times here as I press the trigger back where it's supposed to stop spraying paint, it was still letting out a small amount. This is a very common issue with all airbrushes, and what it usually means is that the trigger spring tension is too loose. So all I needed to do was tighten down the screw on the back. I tightened it down all the way, and this gives a much better seal with the needle and nozzle so paint won't leak out when you just press down without pulling back. And this fixed the problem right away. I have to say that the trigger response in this one was shockingly good. It was very, very responsive. I pull back the smallest amount with my finger and I get paint. So this definitely surprised me, but it's very nice to see. Very responsive airbrush. The paint consistency was also pretty good. There's a few jitters, a few breaks in the line in the beginning, but I'm spraying this at a lower PSI, right around 20 or so. So if you bump this up to 25 or 30, it usually fixes that problem right away. So regarding the atomization of the paint and the quality of the spray, I would also say that this airbrush is very good. Switching over from my Micron, this airbrush definitely has a much higher airspeed. I measured it here at around 6 meters per second, and at 20 psi from a general use airbrush, this is what I expected to see. It's the same as the Eclipse and the Revolution. I was finishing up this portrait, which is going to be one of the next painting tutorials on this channel, and for the majority of it, I used my Iwata Micron and the GSI Krios PS771. But to paint in her shirt on the lower left side of this portrait, I switched over to the Harbor Freight Avanti just to try it out and see how well it compares to much higher end airbrushes. I'm using Createx illustration colors here, and I have to say this airbrush did a fine job. It definitely felt a bit cheap in the hand, but it sprays great, and that's really the most important part. The trigger control was very good, and so was the atomization of the paint. I didn't get any sort of spits or splatters as I was painting this in. One thing that I didn't like is the cup itself. In order for the airbrush to spray, you can't just put 1 or 2 drops of paint in, which is what I normally do when I'm painting. You really have to kind of fill it up because the cup doesn't funnel down very well to the bottom. The paint kind of tends to collect on the side. It's not really a big deal. You just need to add more paint. But besides that, it felt pretty comfortable in the hand and it sprayed well. And finally, the standard soapy water test, checking this while I'm pressing down on the trigger. No bubbles, so there's no leaks. Good to see. So at $25 US, I think that this is a very good starting place to get into airbrushing, just to try to practice the trigger finger, see if you can get down some muscle memory. And I do think that cheap airbrushes like this one hold a pretty good place in the market to use as a backup in case something goes wrong with your main airbrush. You have something to finish your painting. I do hope that that trigger spring assembly problem that I showed earlier in this video is just a problem with my particular airbrush, because if that's an issue across the entire line, that's a major problem and a deal breaker for me. So for someone new who's going to be painting maybe once or twice a year, or to use as a backup airbrush, this one's fine. But if it's in your budget, I'd always recommend going with the real deal, the one that this one copied, which is the Iwata Eclipse. The Eclipse is obviously much more expensive, but it's also a much better airbrush. So that's it for this review. That's my thoughts on it. Thanks for watching. I'll be back here next week.